Hello guys, today I want to show you one line in Sicilian which is named after one American player, Rossolimo, and it has become very popular in the last maybe 10 years. This is the line in Sicilian where after knight c6, white is not going for the main lines with d4, but he goes bishop to b5. This is a bit similar to the Canao attack, which we have seen already. If you remember Canao attack, okay, it was the same move, but after black goes d6. So then we took a look at the move bishop d7, mainly knight d7, which were the most common replies, but knight d6 is transposing actually the line to Rossolimo. But in this move further, of course, apart from this move d6, black can play many other moves like e6, g6, knight f6. What is in general the idea of bishop b5? This is to develop very fast the bishop, but not to c4, because if you remember, we have seen in some other chapters that when you play here the bishop to c4, often black can play e6 and then d5, so this would attack the bishop on d5 on c4, and then you have to move it, and you're losing time. But when you go to b5, now if black wants to attack, he has to play a6. But a6 is not such a useful move, because then you can just capture the knight. And actually, one of the ideas of bishop b5 is to take the knight even if black is not attacking the bishop. So a6 in many occasions will be just a waste of time. Now, what can black do? Let's start with the move d6. So this is transposing, just like I said, to the Canao attack. In this case, white has many possibilities, but usually he goes castle. And now black has to play bishop d7. This is the idea of d6. Black wants actually to play the bishop to d7. So when white takes later the knight, he doesn't want to capture with the pawn already, and he wants to take with the bishop because the bishop is more active and he doesn't have double pawns. Now white can play rook e1 or c3. There are different deviations, or even b3, but rook e1 is the most common. And the idea is to play c3 and d4, but not immediately, because after c3, let's say now when black goes a6, in this case actually white usually don't want to take the knight already, so he has to move back. But if you go back to a4 after b5, yeah, this is possible line, by the way. Now it's something similar to the Ruy Lopez defense, but better is to go to e1, and after a6, instead of moving the bishop to this area, here of course it will be blunder, because after b5, c4 you lose the bishop. No, the bishop has to go to f1. And the point is that now the rook is defending the pawn. And after knight f6, white can play c3. And then already white wants to play d4. And black usually goes bishop to g4. Because now, yes, d4 is a possible move. Even I think it's quite interesting. But of course you have to capture here with the pawn. And although white has double pawns, from the other hand he has a very nice center. He has the pair of bishops who could be very strong later. But not everyone wants to double his pawns, and most people play d3. But I think, yeah, d3 is a good move, but d4 is also a good move. And then the idea of white is that he wants to play later knight to d2. And now again d4 is not possible, because black can capture with the pawn with a knight. So first you have to deal with the spin, so h3. Now of course if black takes, then already white takes with a knight, and everything is ready for d4. Usually black goes to h5, and now white goes g4. So this is one of the possible lines, and then he goes knight h4 with the idea to take the bishop, or if black doesn't move the knight, I think now knight d7 was the best move, but otherwise you can play even f4, f5 to try to win the bishop. And yeah, this is one of the possible lines if black goes d6. Now, Black can play as well, of course, other moves, and e6 is also a possible move. And after e6, white can choose between probably 2 or 3 different plans, so this is quite flexible system. You can take on c6, and now black can capture with both pawns. If he takes with the d pawn, now we can notice that the bishop on c8 remains blocked from everywhere, and even in many occasions white can push e5, if not immediately, a little bit later, in order to stop black from preparing e5. Because if you push the pawn to e5, you can see that now the bishop, okay, it's clear that the pawn cannot move forward, and even if he plays later b6, he has the pawn on c6 who is closing the diagonal. And a6, yes, it's possible, but after c4, for example, basically you are playing against this bishop, and the idea is to develop, to make castle, knight c3, bishop to f4, queen e2, and this is a very positional system, which is around equal, but black has slight problems with this bishop. Even if he takes with the b pawn, which I think makes more sense, again you can play d3 or you can play e5. What is the idea of e5? The idea is that now if black goes d5, that if you want you can capture, and then black will have these weak double pawns, and in many occasions now white is trying to bring this knight to c4. This will be an excellent outpost for the knight. Once again the bishop remains somehow inactive. But after e5 black can play f6, and he is hoping to exchange the f pawn for the e pawn, then somehow to prepare d6 and maybe e5. But this is so very complicated for black, and he must be familiar with those ideas. If you don't want to take the bishop, of course, you can play something else. And you can choose between this plan with c3 and d4. You can play as well even b3. b3 also makes sense, because actually the main idea of the move e6 is that black wants to play knight e7, and then he wants to play a6. Similar to the other line with d6, bishop d7, when he wants to capture with a piece and not to double his pawns. But okay, you can play this system, and then here some people play d4, others play c4 or castle. The idea is that now, because the bishop is hitting the pawn on g7, for black it's not so simple to develop the bishop. And if he plays f6, this is somehow, yeah, some small concession, because after f6 already the diagonal is a bit exposed, and now if you play d6 later, the pawn on e6 is somehow less defended, and white can play maybe f4 or f5. So this is also interesting line for white, b3. Or, like in the other line, you can play castle, and then to make space, exactly the same way for the bishop to retreat to f1. Again with the same idea, c3 and d4. And now black can play many moves. Okay, I don't know what he can do. Knight g6, d5, e5, b5. But you play simply c3. Let's say he plays b5, and then you can play d4. And this will be slightly better for white. I think the main line was now d5. White takes on d5. And then the idea is that if he takes with the pawn, you play d4, and the knight on e7 is pinned, the bishop is blocked, so this is not a good position for black. He has to take with a knight. Then white can play d4, and white has to try to open the position to use the fact that the black king is in the middle. Now if black plays some move like h6 or pushes some pawn, you can play c4 followed by d5, because the pawn is pinned, so she cannot take. And if he takes, you take with a knight. And the idea is that, yeah, now if he takes, of course, this is very good for you, because you attack the pawn, and simply you want to play now c4, knight c3, and white has a very good development. Now, probably the most popular line against this Rossolimo is when black plays g6. This is a line which was heavily played between Fabiano Caruana and Magnus Carlsen. in the last World Championship match. The world champion was playing all the time G6, and Caruana in many games has played this Rossolimo system. From here, White has also actually different ideas. He can take the knight, or he can play castle, or even he can play c3. Usually, people take now on c6, and black again can capture with both pawns, but d takes c is far more popular. And one of the main lines is when white is developing like this. He is playing castle, and then he is playing sometimes h3 to stop the spin. And black has various plans, but if he castles, the idea is that now white goes knight c3. Let's say he plays something, then bishop to e3 or f4, and later white wants to play queen d2 and try to exchange the bishop. Because if you manage to trade this bishop, then on the big diagonal there is less pressure. Black, okay, I will show you now probably the most popular line for black, which is here not to castle but to play knight d7. And then he is playing e5. Bishop e3, now he goes queen e7, and now queen d2. And again the idea is bishop h6. The only way to stop this idea for black is to play h6 himself, which is the main line. And now it seems that white doesn't have too many options, but very common idea is to move the knight from here. So you can push f4 and to open the file for the rook. Now if you can play f4, for instance, if he doesn't take, you can just push f5. If he takes, you can take with the bishop. So later you can move the knight back to f3 or to g4. You can play rook e1, and white has a very active position, and black has to defend now the h-pawn. He has double pawns, so black has to be careful. Another plan, like I told you, is to castle first, and after bishop g7, again to play c3 or rook e1 with the same idea like before, to push c3 and d4. Let's say after knight f6, you can here even play e5. There is such a line as well, e5, knight d5, and now white goes knight c3. What is the idea of this move? The idea is that now if he takes, we take with the d pawn, and then he has to castle, obviously, and after bishop f4, for black it's very difficult to push the pawn to d6 because white has more hits, which means that the bishop is a bit closed. So later you go queen d2, rook d1, so you play on the d file. You can again move to h6 later to trade the bishop. And this is a very pleasant position for white, because for black it's very difficult to find any active move. That's why he has to play knight c7. And now white takes usually the knight. And then you can play d3, for instance. This is a very common line. And now after castle you can play h3 to stop the spin on g4. Then the knight goes to e4. So this is one of the main lines. Another line is if white plays c3 first, and then you play rook e1. And now the idea is that you want to play d4. But if you play d4 now, black has a very clever move to play d5. And after e5, he has this good outpost for the knight, which of course is not the end of the world. You can just exchange this knight quite easy. Or you can play here the move h3, because this move is actually a useful move to avoid this spin later. And now d5 is actually not so great like before, because your pawn is still there, so you can play d3 and the knight is trapped. Or if the knight moves back to e8, then already after d4, he cannot jump to e4. So black has to find some very clever moves now, or if he plays d6, already d4, and d5 is a waste of time because he has played d6. So this is also a very tricky line, which black has to know what to do. But you see that in general in Rossolimo, if you want to follow, for example, only one plan, you can play against d6, e6, g6. You just go with the bishop, then you go castle, rook e1. If the bishop is attacked, he can go back, and then you just prepare c3 and d4. So it's quite, I think, simple. And finally, let me show you another idea. We can play here c3 immediately. Because if bishop g7, d4, I think already white has some advantage, but you have to know how to face the move pawn takes, and now queen to b6. Because, yes, you can capture, of course, the knight and just to play h3. This is, I think, also pleasant for white, but much better is to play immediately knight c3. But you have to know that this is a mistake for black to take this pawn, because, surprisingly, we play knight to d5, attacking the queen. Clearly he cannot take here because knight c7 check, queen f5 simply bishop d2, so he has to go back. He has to take the knight, you take with the queen. Again, he cannot take because of this check, and simply, if he goes here, you can just play now bishop f4, and this check is coming, castle, and this is very, very big advantage for white. So after c3, black has to play knight f6 first. And then you can choose between queen e2 or e5. There are different deviations. So overall, Rossolimo is very interesting, and this is a good attempt to avoid the main lines where white has to play d4 and has to learn a lot of theory. That's why many players, even at the top level, have started to play Rossolimo, because it's more easy to prepare here with white.